been a real pleasure to be here. I feel replete with stimulating ideas, and I'm going to go away with new enthusiasm for my subject area. So that's wonderful, thank you. My background is primarily sort of art history and visual culture, and I currently teach in the English department, like you do, at the University of Bedfordshire. And my research area, broadly speaking, is the long 19th century, and I'm particularly interested in what I keep returning to is the subject of light. So I'm interested in the cultural history of light. Now, this today has been all about the object, explicitly, and of course there's a little bit of a challenge there for me, because light experienced at the human perceptual level is not understood to be an object. And in my repetitive returns to it, it's constantly shifting ontologically and epistemologically. So there are numerous challenges that I've faced in terms of trying to think about light. And the way I've sort of gone about it is really thinking about the encounter between light as energy and the matter of the material world and the drama of that encounter, and how light shows itself to us. And of course I was thinking about that a lot today in the objects that we were looking at, and the type of spaces that they were in, the type of surface textures that we see, the degree to which they are opaque or transparent. All of those things really spoke to me. So that's in terms of my own personal interest in today. Just a couple of themes that popped up, one of which was boredom, that was mentioned. I wasn't bored at all, but in the act of returning and repeating, we can encounter predictability, tedium, and familiarity. And I wondered at what point, and if anyone's willing to own up to have experienced boredom with their object or with the process, and if that can in any way be productive. What does it mean when attention slips over into boredom? Jonathan Crary talks about this in terms of the end of the 19th century and acts of repetitive labour and things. And so maybe boredom isn't the right word, maybe reverie would be better, whether this process produced anything of that for you. So I just throw that out there and be interested to know whether boredom was productive, if it indeed occurred. And at what point curiosity was exhausted. You spent time, were you spent in the process? Was it no longer a curiosity for you? Because and I thought of that when Leonie was talking about the loss of the impact of the first impression, and how you wanted to vicariously experience other people's first impressions. And so there's a balance there between spending a lot of time and also the uniqueness of that first impression. And that perhaps shouldn't be lost in this process as well. Knowing and not knowing, that was very interesting, and the frustrations and the different types of knowledge that occurred through not knowing, if that doesn't sound like too much of a paradox. It made me think of Keats's idea of negative capability, where he embraces uncertainty, ambiguity, the blurring of experience. And that then did loop me back round to this word that keeps recurring, intimacy. And I only want to say one word about that, really. To intimate is to hint only. And I kind of like that double meaning of intimacy, that it's a hinting, it's a sort of sideline. Thank you. Boundaries, one final thought. Quite a lot of people spoke about the boundary between subject and object and negotiating that. And my object. And it made me think of William James's theory of the empirical self, where your identity is located, or your subjectivity is located beyond you in your objects. So an extended sense of subjectivity. And then that looped me more in terms of more recent research, to the cognitive science or cognitive philosopher Andy Clark, who talks about extended mind theory, where our thinking occurs out there in the world with our objects, and that seems to be going on a lot today. And that was very interesting for me. My final word is I'm dying to know what the legacy will be, and that's great. But it already has happened in many respects. You know, what you have created today is certainly weighty scholarship for all of us. So thank you.
Hello. Well, I'll try and be brief. Thank you so much for today. It's been really interesting and even a little bit invigorating, which is marvellous. Now, I'm a geographer, and geography hasn't been mentioned, I think, the word. But the part of my work that's relevant to today is I've worked with a lot of students who work on collections and collecting, and are particularly interested in the spatiality of collections in museum and other contexts. And they've worked on collecting insects, artworks, photographs, strange things called ethnographic objects, anything that moves, basically. And I'm particularly interested in the mobility of objects. And so that interest was tweaked in various ways today. I'm not going to be too bullish about geography, but I did want to mention a couple of other disciplines to underline the point. Well, firstly about history. What's interesting, certainly the first part of today, is to me partly is that historians are clearly discovering material culture in one way or another and encountering other disciplines in the process. But historians have written about material culture before, but often in the context of popular history. So this is back to Margot's point about other engagements that are refused or denied in this process. So popular history, reenactment, etc. And I was thinking about Raphael Samuel's book Theatres of Memory at several points today in that context. But apart from history, archaeology, I'd underline that point, a discipline that's all about objects, artifacts, assemblages. And just to mention, there's obviously a very good archaeology department here, and there's someone called Sarah Byrne in your department here who has written a very interesting paper on archaeological ways of thinking, actually I would say spatial ways of thinking in the context of ethnographic museum collections. And this is in a book that she co-edited, this is Sarah Byrne, Reassembling the Collection, Ethnographic Museums and Indigenous Agency. So as well as archaeologists, you might also think about your architects. I think the noise here, all the wood here and the scaffolding, I think it's the end of year show at the Bartlett School in a week's time. And my son is graduating, so I'm very happy about that noise. But architects work very much or think a lot about and write a lot about knowing through making, and the degree structures that they have are very much about that. So, bring in your architects as well. I mentioned ethnographic museums a moment ago, and there's a lot of work rethinking ethnographic museums in various parts of the world. And the one thing that work has in common is that to think about these collections relationally, both the gathering of them together relationally and what can be done with them now relationally. And in that literature, it would, I think, be a sin to suggest that there was anything such as an unmediated encounter with an object. All encounters are mediated, pre-mediated, intermediated. And so that point about curators that was made is very important. The point about all the people involved in making objects is very important. The point about technicians, the conservators, all the gang of people who give these objects their life and manage them and look after them and care for them and sometimes let them out is all very, very relevant here. In terms of words that we mentioned and words that we didn't mention, I thought it was interesting. We didn't, I think, mention the word colonial in the context of collections, even in the context of Galton, which is quite interesting. And the politics of this collection or these collections at UCL, as well as other kinds of collections, obviously that's an important theme. And I did wonder whether politics is perhaps a little bit too boring these days. And you're busy having fun, but what about the politics of these things? Which are owned, of course, by UCL, not any of you individually, I suppose. A point about form, I think it was really interesting that we returned to that, partly about the question about the output, but also in the presentation. I thought all the presentations were never bored me at all, by the way, and kept my attention, and some of them were, so poetic. And I think that interest around performance, it certainly enlivened the occasion, but it's obviously as a bigger field now, the way that artists and creative artists of various kinds are engaging with museum collections, for example. 1 minute, right. There's more to be said there, perhaps we'll say it in discussion. One point I did want to make is about perhaps another of Margot's methodologies refused or denied, which is the book that you may have heard of, The History of the World in 100 Objects, which is obviously such a global phenomenon, the Neil MacGregor book and the British Museum, that it's part of the kind of strategic plan to translate this book into as many languages as possible. But what's very interesting is that book and that methodology that he uses in that very successful work and all the spin-offs that came with it has not really received academic critique. Maybe you will know of an academic critique. You do wonder why that is. Is this something to do again with the split between popular and academic? Why has it not received a critique? I'd quite like I'd like to know the answer to that. And this relationship between the academic and the popular is really interesting, actually, in the case of Galton, because I read somewhere that every time Galton published a scientific specialist paper, be it on meteorology or eugenics or whatever, he always published a popular version as well. So he was very much engaged in the creation of, or the extension of the knowledge he was on the disciplines he was involved in forming. But back to MacGregor, just a small point about the form of that approach that he takes in that. For all its celebration of diversity and of difference and of multiplicity, and to some extent also of decentering the expert knowledge, somehow the expert knowledge gets centred, and it somehow flattens and homogenizes the human story in these 100 objects, becomes just one story in some senses. And so I'd be very interested to hear some critical reflection on that book and its influence beyond. Okay, I think Heidi will say some more points that I would have said more inexpertly. So I'd just like to conclude by thanking you again for inviting me and for your conversations. I think the conversational model is just great, particularly in these days of academic individualism and competition. Thank you.
Congratulations to Leonie and to Kate and all of the presenters today. You all did, I think, really achieve something with the project, and I wasn't bored either. You can pick up on the boredom question. I'm in the anthropology department here at UCL. I'm one of the curators of the ethnography collections, one of the editors of the Journal of Material Culture, and I run a website called Material World. And I've been part of, I think, the kind of second wave of interest in material culture, one that very much has been spearheaded in the anthropology department here by people like Danny Miller and Chris Tilley, who are archaeologists who became anthropologists. And I suppose I've seen this kind of cross-disciplinary pickup of these words, material culture, which have kind of migrated into the term materiality, and these explorations coming from many different angles now for the last 10 or so years. And they've gone to some places, but they've also met some pretty interesting dead ends, I think. And I have sort of three thematic comments that I'd like to make. I thought I'd try and lift the energy and be a bit polemical maybe and get the discussion going. So these are deliberately polemical. They're not critical of the project at all. They're intended to just start us thinking a little bit. So I have 3 points. The first point is about collecting, picking up a bit on what Felix was just saying. I was struck that there wasn't that much said in the presentations about the collections that these objects came from. Why is the photo album embedded in the art? I mean, we know it's now embedded in art, but what happened to make that? Whose decision was that? What is the rationale and thinking behind it? And one of the things that you've done, if you're thinking about output, is you've created a new collection that cross-cuts the ways in which UCL's collections have been divided by bringing these objects together. And I really think you should push that. I mean, what happens now when you bring these objects together and compare the work that you've done across these different objects? If you're really committed to cross-disciplinary work, you should be able to do that, and I'd really like to see you doing that. And that brings me on to this. So the first point I think is worth thinking through is actually the act of collecting as one way in which these objects are brought into being. And Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett wrote a very inspiring article that still continues to be influential in 1991 called Objects of Ethnography. She talks about the act of surgery, of cutting, required to put something on display. You put the cup and the saucer together on a table with a knife and a fork, but where do you stop? At some point there has to be a kind of surgical process that takes the object out of the endless context that it could be located within. And anthropology is, for me, all about that proliferation of context and a kind of holism that I do think has been lost from other disciplines. But my second point is disciplinary knowledge. I think the case of the stool is a really good point. Why in a room are we sitting there assuming stools have a particular cultural significance and completely sort of unaware, for many people perhaps, or it hasn't come up in the conversation about the golden stool of Asante. I mean, the British Museum is, well aware of that. We're talking about the politics of collection and colonialism. So I think that, and I've seen this very much in our ethnography collection where we have very little provenance for many of the objects. And there's been a split, and I think this is mirrored in the way in which people approach the material turn within many disciplines, between the disciplined knowledge, which is about genealogies of thinking, in which objects are illustrations, they're types that refer back to bigger intellectual questions. And then this material turn, which casts that aside, in which we're thrown back very much on ourselves, actually. And I feel like all this discussion about the psychoanalytic models, my object, and that's very much about the individual researcher. And I think it's important to, first of all, think about where is our discipline and not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We should know about this cultural significance of stools in Africa, and that should be a part of. We should keep some context. We shouldn't cut the theory from the material. And at the same time, we need to understand the categories by which we understand materiality. So words that have come up today: intimacy, possession, emotion, affect. Those are all words that have their own kind of cultural location and historicity, and those really need to be acknowledged. So the definition of intimacy, I was really struck by the definitions of intimacy that people were throwing out. They're not my definitions of intimacy. I don't think they're necessarily the definitions that we all have in all registers of our own lives. They're particular focuses of individual scaled down connection through particular kinds of haptic connection, but not others. And we have other kinds of intimacy that we're all engaged with: familial intimacy, group intimacies, sexual and other kinds of erotic sensations which are exuberant, which are uncontained. And I think we need to really challenge and explore the historically grounded categories we're using, even within this seeming space of phenomenological experience that is disconnected from our disciplines, perhaps, or the languages we're familiar with from within our disciplines. And finally, the third thing is politics, and I do want to go back to that because it's very important to me. Severin Fowles, an archaeologist, has written a really nice series of critiques of this material turn. And in an article that I think is not published, but you can find on his academia.edu site, called The Perfect Subject, he points out that this material turn in the 1980s emerges not just as a kind of backlash to the kind of literary theory and criticism and sort of postmodern emphasis on everything as text, but also at a time, particularly for disciplines like archaeology and anthropology, when we really had to lose our traditional subjects. And his polemical piece, which I'm not sure I completely agree with, but I think makes a point worth thinking about, is that objects become the new subaltern. We can speak for objects and on behalf of objects in ways we can't speak on behalf of the people that we once spoke on behalf of in a previous colonial era. And he sort of talks about objects becoming the perfect subject, these silent things that we can speak for in ways that we've just, are no longer entitled to for people that are speaking back at us. And he talks about contradictions in theorization of materiality. He really hacks on Latour, he hacks on a lot of other material culture theorists that we want objects to be actors, we want objects to be participants in our social worlds, but we talk about their subjugation and their sort of co-option into our systems, and we can't have it both ways. I think that politics and the recognition of the power relations that are underpinning these modes of interpretation and these methodologies, like the necessity to unpack the sort of historical subject positions of our understandings of ourselves as researchers, our understanding of what intimacy means, our understanding of what our work means, also has to be attended to. And I hijacked a few people and took them to see this work that I've been doing with a single object in the ethnography collection. I'd love it if everyone else could see it. It's only open sporadically. But we focus on a single object, but it was all about connecting that object back to its community in New Zealand and co-opting it and enfolding it in an epistemology that comes from an indigenous Maori perspective, which is completely different to the kinds of engagements that we've discussed here. And in the ethnography collections, if people come in like that, they don't wear gloves because they have the right to touch. And I don't have the right to stop them. And we have to kind of obligation, our obligation of care is also about our responsibility to the object, not just in the terms of conservation in the sense that we may be familiar with here, but in terms of managing objects in ways that are respectful to other sets of cultural protocols. And that's definitely something we really want to keep doing with the ethnography collections. So I'll stop there, but I hope that's just got us things to discuss perhaps.
Very good. Now, everything sensible has already been said, of course, and so I'm left with saying things that are not very sensible, and I'll do my best not to be exhaustive and not to be exhausting. Now, you're all converts in the sense that you're all here because of a pre-established interest. So I don't have to do anything. In fact, today we didn't actually ask a basic question. Why should we do it? Why should we go to such trouble to be so methodologically sophisticated and try to integrate objects and so on? I always ask, especially historians, why do you do it when you could do something else that's much more easy? And my sense is that I have 3 points. One relates to the object, the second one relates to what I call the environment. It might be the museum environment specifically, and the third one, the major one, is about research. The object is that behind the category of material culture you have quite different things, and that the variety came up quite well from 2D to 3D objects. And indeed also this kind of continuous relationship between the unique and the not so unique objects. I much prefer non-unique objects, and I go and try to find them in museums that actually are places that are very unlikely to have non-unique objects. And we were also talking about how objects might or might not fit into a pigeonhole. Well, if they don't, then you need to change the pigeonhole. And that's where it becomes very rewarding to work with objects. The second point is about the environment. As I said, you had a pre-established tendency, because of the specific engagement with the UCL collection, to think that this environment is specific to the museum environment. Of course, there is a much wider world of material culture. Only rarely we talk about prices. We talk about a commercial context. Today it's incredibly important. There was a little cup sold a few weeks ago in Hong Kong by Christie's at $38 million that made the news. So you realize that there are some circulation and indeed appreciation of objects beyond this focus on collections. But within this, let's call it environment, we also have to realize that there is a regime of power. And this power is about what you are shown, what has been collected in the past. So it's not just power in the present, what you have access to and so on. And in my sense is that objects are very much treated a bit like dying patients. So they are kind of protected in an excessive way. So your love kind of metaphor becomes the love very romantic for the dying sweetheart. But the most important part, I think, is the research part. And there is a kind of very practical thing, how you use object as tools, and indeed also the fact that you're not the first one to look at these objects. For the very fact that they've been collected in the past, you're not the first researcher to do this process, and you must be very much aware of that. But going to more the kind of implications of research, I think the kind of research that turns out that you have created is one, first of all, that is intensive, in the sense that you put a lot of work into something quite precise. And there you create a tension because a lot of research needs to fulfill some scientific rigor, and this is about being replicable. And that's where it becomes a bit contentious of how much you run little experiments that are not, you cannot reproduce another time or 100 times and so on. And including the fact that you do it with one object, but the world of object is infinite. So you're doing really a tiny kind of piece of a big puzzle. The second one in terms of research is that, of course, objects and material culture allowed some lateral thinking to open up some established categories through which we think, especially within certain disciplines. And I think that's an important part, in particular the fact that we tend to start with questions, surely from the field of history. Objects kind of slightly invert that process, because the object actually should be the way in which the object itself makes you ask certain questions. I do that with students. Instead of asking a question we discuss at the end, I give them an image of an object, or I send them to show an object, say, now you ask the question. And they kind of completely lost. So there is a kind of process of openness of the research methodology. What I find very striking is that also research seems to have become very reflective of the way in which it happens, and therefore our discussion about intimacy, about this love, that has the tendency of giving, I always thought it gives a lot of agency to the object. It turns out to give a lot of agency to the researcher, because it's all about you as a researcher. And I'm not, critical in this case. I'm just, making a point. And there, I was trying to find a counterexample. In fact, we have the counterexample at the end of the corridor, because we have Jeremy Bentham smiling at us. But I don't think many of you would like to be intimate with Jeremy Bentham, going out for dinner with Jeremy Bentham and so on. So I was thinking, as a counterexample of I remember when Jeremy Bentham was restuffed. He used to be a massive man, and he was restuffed. He became a very small man in the late 1990s. That, I think, is a relationship between the object and the research that I see as a new area. It used to be about objects and meaning that produce material culture, as if meaning was completely separate from the research. And now I think we are becoming more critical. So I take the critical part as very positive. The slightly more emotional one, and I am a harsh Italian clearly in this case, I see it as slightly more contentious. And I will stop here. Thank you.